Freight Manifest for Solith Station's inbound cargo. Sector 7. Bay allocation codes. Assignment weights in descending order. Runs to 41 lines on a busy morning. A slow morning, it's 23. I have read it aloud every working day for 11 years, and I could not tell you why I started. That is not quite true. I know why I started. I just never thought it was worth explaining to anyone, because the explanation is boring. I had a supervisor, Oren Valeth, told me on my second day that the best way to catch a misentry was to read the numbers out loud to yourself. The ear catches what the eye slides past. Oren retired 6 years ago and I never stopped doing it, because he was right, and because by then it had become the shape of my morning the same way coffee had. Not a decision, just a groove worn into the day. The annex is a long room. Stone vaulting, original construction, pale gray with blue-veined marble along the lower third of the walls. Filing alcoves on one side, document terminals on the other, and at the far end a pair of clerestory windows that catch the early light off the Veth Solara orbital ring before any other window on the station. On a good morning, the light comes in at a low angle and travels the length of the room, and by the time it reaches my terminal, it is warm and slightly gold, and it has crossed 40 meters of old stone and older air, and it makes the room feel like the inside of something that's been quietly considered for a very long time. The founding chamber is on the other side of the east wall. I knew that. Everyone who worked in the annex knew it. The wall between the records annex and the founding chamber is 3 meters of solid stone. Veth Solara blue-gray granite, original quarry from the station's founding period. You do not hear through it. You do not feel through it, exactly, though there is something. A low undertone, barely pressure more than sound, that was present on some mornings and absent on others, and that I had come to think of the way you think of a building settling. Not a noise, just the station being itself. I did not know what it was. I had worked the annex for 11 years and I did not know that what I was feeling was a resonance frequency, a harmonic that an ancient dragon uses at the base of her chest cavity when she is resting in full tone, and that it was the acoustic anchor for 14 territorial boundary agreements that had kept 9 packs from open conflict for 240 years. I did not know any of that. I knew the manifest ran 41 lines on a busy morning, and I read it aloud to myself because Oren Valeth told me to. My name is Desavos. I am 60 years old. I have been a records clerk and document librarian for 38 years, the last 11 of them at the Veth Solara Sanctuary Station Administrative Annex. I am the kind of person who color codes her filing tabs and brings the same lunch every Tuesday and has a list of preferred terminal seats ranked by proximity to the clerestory light. I have mild hearing loss in my left ear from a childhood illness, which means I have always read aloud, slightly louder than I realize, and I have always positioned myself so the sound travels toward my better ear, which means I have always, without knowing it, been speaking toward the east wall. There are some things you do for 38 years, and you understand exactly what you are doing and why. There are others you do because you started them one morning when you were new, and no one told you to stop, and they became part of the shape of work the way any repeated thing becomes part of a shape. Gradually, without declaration, until the day you try to imagine the morning without them and find you cannot. Reading the manifest aloud was the second kind. By year 3, I would not have said I was doing it consciously. By year 7, I would have been startled to be told it was notable. By year 11, it was as automatic as breathing. Something my lungs and my vocal cords and my better ear had agreed to do together, while the rest of me concentrated on the numbers. The founding voice's name is Vethasora Keth. She is, by the Conclave's reckoning, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years old. The records from her earliest period are incomplete. She apparently finds amusing in the dry way that very old things find the limitations of shorter-lived beings amusing. She is charcoal gray, with deep violet undertones that show in direct light, and she is large in the way that certain old mountains are large. Not dramatically, not oppressively, but with a quiet completeness that makes the space around her seem organized by her presence rather than containing it. Her eyes are amber, not the warm amber of the younger dragons I had occasionally seen in the station corridors, but a deep, resinous amber that looked like something that had been accumulating color for several centuries. I did not know what she looked like for 11 years, because I had never been in the founding chamber. The annex staff were not restricted from the chamber. There was no rule against it. It simply was not part of our work, and the founding chamber was very much a space that clarified what was and was not part of your work by the quality of the silence that met you at threshold. I had walked past the entrance twice in 11 years, once when a new filing terminal was being delivered and the corridor routing went that way, and once when I got turned around coming back from the station's secondary supply depot. Both times I had looked at the entrance, seen the height of it, felt the quality of the air moving past the threshold, and kept walking. The undertone in the wall, the pressure not sound, I had first noticed about 10.5 years ago. Not on my first day, not in my first month. It takes time to know a room well enough to notice what it does and does not do. By 10.5 years ago, I had been in the annex long enough that I could tell the difference between the station's normal mechanical hum, which lives in the floor and the ventilation, and something that lived specifically in the east wall. It was not always there. It was strongest in the mornings. Roughly between the time I arrived and mid-shift. It faded through the afternoon. On some days it was barely present. On others it had a quality I could only describe as full, as if the wall itself had taken a breath and was holding it in a way that felt considered rather than passive. Those were the mornings the light came in well, and the room felt like the inside of something ancient and purposeful, and I did my best work on those mornings, and I never asked why. I have a habit. My colleague Petra Mail calls it a mild pathology, with the affection that means she finds it more useful than not, of not asking why. When something is working, you document what is, you verify what changes, and you do not speculate beyond the data. Oren Valeth had the same habit. It may be why we understood each other. It may be why neither of us thought anything in particular about the east wall undertone for the better part of a decade. 8 months ago I took medical leave. It was not dramatic. I had a procedure, a routine enough thing, the kind that is only not dramatic when you are on the other side of it and looking back. I was away for 3 weeks. I arranged my filing before I left, handed off the active consignment logs to Petra, and went. I did not think about the wall while I was gone. I did not think about the manifest or the morning light, or the way the room sounds when no one is reading anything. I thought about the things you think about when you are having a procedure and then recovering from it. The specifics of the next few days. The logistics of the return. The small accommodations your body requires when it has been asked to do something difficult. I am not a person who misses work in the abstract. I miss the work's routine, which is a different thing, the shape of the day more than the substance of it. I came back on a Monday, read the manifest, 27 lines, a slow start to the week, and noticed within the first hour that the undertone was different, quieter, not absent, reduced to something I had to concentrate to find. The way you have to concentrate to hear a sound you have been told is present, rather than one you simply hear. I thought the station had done some maintenance while I was gone, adjusted something in the ventilation or the structural dampening. I made a note to ask facilities and then did not ask because I got busy, because the undertone came back over the following weeks. Not all at once, but gradually, the way a room warms when you open a window on a good day and let the outside air work on it. By the end of my second week back, it was as present as it had ever been, and I stopped noticing the difference. That is, roughly, everything I knew about my own situation for 11 years. Now I will tell you what was happening on the other side of the wall, because I only know it, because someone told me, and because even now, writing it down, I find it difficult to hold in my head, without something in my chest going quiet in a way that I do not have good words for. Veth Asoraketh had been losing her song for 11 years. That is the Conclave's terminology. The song, though it is not metaphorical in the way the word might suggest. What she produces is a resonance frequency, a deep, sub-audible harmonic that she generates continuously from her chest cavity when she is resting in what the Conclave's acoustic scholars call full presence. It is not a sound she makes deliberately, in the way you might hum while you work. It is closer to a condition of being, the acoustic equivalent of a heartbeat, a thing her body does when she is fully herself and fully settled in her place. The resonance frequency had been the anchor for the Veth-Solara territorial boundary agreements since the station was built. 14 agreements across 9 packs, encompassing transit rights, resource allocation, and the acoustic sovereignty protocols that governed which draconic communication frequencies could operate in which sectors. The agreements were maintained in the Conclave's formal legal archive, but the active, living underpinning of them, the thing that made them real in the bodies and nervous systems of the dragons who operated under them, rather than merely notional in a document, was the founding voice's continuous resonance. It was the signal that said, "This ground is witnessed, this station is centered, the terms are held." 11 years ago, it had begun to fade. Very slowly at first, within the range of normal variation. Seasonal fluctuation, the scholars had thought. Mild metabolic adjustment. These things happened over centuries. They logged it and watched it. 7 years ago, the decline became statistically significant. Still within the margins of what an ancient dragon might experience, without serious cause, but no longer easy to attribute to normal variation. The scholars expanded their monitoring. They ran assessments. They measured the crystal resonance of the chamber walls. They tested for interference from the station's communication arrays. They analyzed the mineral content of Vethasauraketh's meals, the acoustic properties of the chamber's ceiling vaulting, the harmonic interaction between her frequency and the frequencies produced by the station's ventilation systems at various speeds and temperatures. Vethasauraketh submitted to the testing with the patient resignation of someone who has been tested many times over many centuries and has a complex relationship with the concept of scholarly certainty. She answered the scholars' questions. She allowed the monitoring equipment. She observed that the scholars were thorough and diligent, and that their thoroughness and diligence were, in their own way, admirable, and that she was nonetheless fairly confident they were looking in the wrong places. When asked where the right place was, she said she did not know. That was the problem. The tests found nothing wrong. Her physical condition was, by every available measure, what they expected of a dragon her age: substantial, stable, and not particularly forthcoming about its own inner workings. Ancient dragons are not a fully mapped terrain. The scholars documented the decline, issued a formal notice to the Conclave, and continued watching. 4 years ago, the Conclave convened an advisory assembly. 9 senior acoustic scholars from 4 territorial packs, meeting over 6 days in the founding chamber. A considerable undertaking, given the logistics of assembling that many large ancient dragons in one space. They produced a detailed report. The report noted the decline, confirmed it was accelerating, suggested 17 possible contributing factors ranging from the plausible to the speculative, and concluded that further monitoring was recommended. Vethasauraketh attended 2 of the 6 sessions. She found the remaining 4 insufficiently interesting to justify the disruption to her schedule. The chief scholar of the advisory assembly noted in the report's appendix that the founding voice had expressed, in the old formal register, that the assembly would benefit from thinking less about frequency and more about texture, and that this advice had not been incorporated into the report's primary recommendations, because no one was entirely certain what it meant. The schedule, as it had been for 11 years, consisted largely of resting in her alcove in the founding chamber, drifting in and out of what the scholars called resonant rest, a state somewhere between sleep and deep contemplation that ancient dragons of her lineage used to maintain their long-range perceptual faculties and their harmonic coherence. She had been doing this for centuries. The difference over the past 11 years was subtle. She could still reach the state, but it had become harder to hold, like trying to maintain a grip on something smooth that used to be textured. Nothing was wrong exactly. Things were not quite right. The resonant rest kept sliding towards something lighter, something less full, the way sleep slides toward the surface when the room has changed and you cannot say how. She noticed, approximately 10.5 years ago, and this she told the assembly herself, afterward, from her own account, that the mornings had changed quality. Not catastrophically, not in any way she could have articulated precisely at the time. The mornings had had something. And then they had it somewhat less, and she had turned that observation over for years without being able to identify its shape. She knew the annex was on the other side of the east wall. She had known it for 200 years. Records staff came and went. She had never paid attention to any of them in any particular way. Because the annex existed at the outer edge of her awareness, at her age and in her resting state, extended perhaps 100 meters in all directions, with varying degrees of resolution. The annex registered the way a room in a house registers when you are sitting in another room. Presence, some movement. The occasional specific sound that briefly sharpens into clarity before returning to background. What sharpened into clarity, she said, was a voice. Reading numbers, not every day, not at first, but frequently enough and at a consistent enough hour that her resting state had incorporated it the way a room incorporates a recurring sound. Not as interruption, but as texture. A human voice reading cargo weights and bay allocation codes and consignment reference numbers, steadily, at a low pitch, toward the east wall. Not always the same numbers, they changed every day, as numbers in a working record change because they were real numbers representing real things. That was, she said, a significant part of it. The fact that the numbers were real. She had in her centuries of resonant rest been present for a great many sounds. Music, which was lovely and she appreciated it, though its patterns were self-contained in a way that did not help her in the particular way she needed to be helped. Conversation was useful in its own ways, but which had the quality of moving between positions rather than describing them. Ritual language, which was precise, but which she had heard so many times that its familiarity had made it smooth in a different way than helpfully smooth. Worn down, rather than burnished. The voice reading cargo manifest was none of these things. It was, she said, the closest human analog she had encountered to the acoustic foundation she needed for resonant rest. The language of specific, real, things. Bay allocation code, 7keth41. A container of exactly that weight, at exactly that location, verifiable and verified. The numbers did not claim to mean anything beyond themselves. They were accurate descriptions of a real world, and they arrived in a consistent pattern, and they were directed, habitually and without intent, toward the frequency-receptive surface of 3 meters of founding period granite. She did not know why it helped. She was not certain, even after everything that followed, that she had the right language for what it had done. The nearest she could come, she said, was this. The human voice reading real things was a particular kind of acoustic grounding. Not music, not language in the way she used language. Something more fundamental than either. The sound of a world being accurately described, in precise units, by a creature that had no reason to do it except habit and a retired supervisor's good advice. It anchored her the way a specific and concrete thing anchors you when abstraction becomes dangerous. Not dramatically, not completely, but enough, and consistently, and on the particular daily schedule that resonant rest requires. Morning, before the station's general activity level rose, and the acoustic environment thickened with interference. And then, 8 months ago, it stopped. The decline in the founding voice's resonance, from the day I began my medical leave, went from gradual to precipitous. In 3 weeks, the monitoring instruments recorded a drop equivalent to 4 years of previous gradual decline. The change was so sharp that the duty scholar initially suspected instrument error and spent 2 days recalibrating before accepting that the readings were accurate. An emergency notice was filed with the Conclave. An assembly was called. Veth Asoraketh, the first time in anyone's working memory, attended every session without being asked. She did not tell them what had changed. She said this not from withholding, but from genuine uncertainty. She knew something had stopped, but she could not name what it was. Only that the quality of the mornings had become very poor, and that her resonant rest had become almost entirely inaccessible. The grip entirely gone, the smooth surface, smooth in all the wrong ways. They spent 8 months trying to identify the cause. They tested the structural integrity of the founding chamber. They tested the station's acoustic dampening systems. In specialists in ancient draconic metabolic acoustics from 2 other sanctuary stations, experts in their field who arrived with considerable equipment and left 3 weeks later with considerably more data and considerably less certainty. than they had started with. They tested mineral composition of the granite walls, harmonic interference from the station's communication arrays, 11 possible dietary factors, and the resonance properties of the chamber's flooring, following a repaving project done 14 months earlier. That is the effects of a new ventilation duct installed in the corridor outside the founding chamber 2 years ago. They tested the resonance interaction between Vethasora Keth's frequency and the frequencies of the other elder dragons who visited the station regularly, hypothesizing that a change in visiting patterns might have altered her acoustic environment in a way they had not accounted for. Nothing they tested explained the 3-week precipice or the subsequent slow recovery. I came back from medical leave, and the decline slowed, and then over 2 weeks reversed. The Conclave's assembly noted the reversals with relief and attributed it to the acoustic stabilization work there. Specialists had performed on the chamber during my 3 weeks away, which had been substantial and technically sophisticated, and had taken a great deal of expertise and considerable budget, and which, it turned out, had done nothing. The reversal continued past the point attributable to their intervention, tracked by the monitoring instruments with precise indifference to anyone's preferred explanation. And the SMC chief acoustic scholar, Veth Korath Sol, found himself looking at a data curve that had reversed without a corresponding technical event. He was the kind of scholar who does not let that stand. Veth Korath Sol is a compact elder whose scales are the particular deep blue-gray of old slate, and who has the focused quality of someone who has been wrong before, and found it instructive, and has spent considerable effort since then on identifying the category of thing he is most likely to be wrong about. He had spent 8 months assuming the cause of the resonance decline was in the founding chamber. He spent 1 day, after the data failed to support that assumption, expanding his frame. He requested access to the station's complete administrative logs for the past 11 years. Not the technical logs. The administrative logs. Attendance records, staff scheduling, shift start times and durations, sick leave records, maintenance windows. Everything that recorded who had been physically present in which part of the station, and when, for 11 years. He spent 6 days going through them. On the 7th day, he came to the annex. I was reading the manifest, 33 lines, a medium morning, and I heard the door, which I always leave open, because the room breathes better with it open, and because the light from the facey corridor adds to what comes through the clerestory windows, and I looked up, and there was a dragon standing in the doorway. He was not as large as I had understood from the assembly notices that the senior conclave elders were, though he was large enough that the doorway framed him with very little margin on either side, and he had entered, with the careful attention to scale that large beings learn when they spend time in spaces built for smaller ones. His coloring was the deep blue-gray of old slate, which in the annex's morning light has a slight luminosity to it that I had not expected. His eyes were pale gold. He was looking at the terminal I was sitting at, and then at me, and then at the east wall, and then back at me, with an expression I did not then have a name for, but that I would come to recognize as the particular focus of someone who has just seen data, confirmed something they had been fairly certain of, and found the confirmation both satisfying and more complicated than they expected. He said, "May I ask how long you have worked in this room?" I told him 11 years. He asked if I could show him my standard morning workflow. I said that I was in fact in the middle of it. He said he was aware of that and asked if I would continue, so I continued. He stood in the doorway, not entering fully, which I later understood was consideration for the space, and also possibly for me, because a senior conclave elder occupying the full width of a document annex is a particular kind of experience to have sprung on you without preparation, and I read the rest of the manifest. 33 lines, bay allocations, consignment weights, reference codes. I read them the way I always read them, steadily in order, at the pitch that carries to my better ear, toward the east wall. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Are you aware that the chamber on the other side of that wall is the founding chamber?" I said yes. "Are you aware of who rests in the founding chamber?" I said. I knew it was the founding voice, Vethasora Keth. I knew that much from the station's public orientation documents, and from 11 years of occasionally feeling the wall's undertone, though I did not mention the undertone. Another silence then. How long have you been reading aloud like this in the mornings? Since my second week, told him. 11 years more or less. My supervisor had recommended it for catching errors. He asked if I had ever been away from the station for an extended period during those 11 years. I told him about the medical leave. He asked the exact dates. I gave them to him from memory. I have good retention for dates. It is part of the work. And I watched something happen in his expression, a quietness that was not absence of thought, but rather the opposite. The moment when a number that has been moving around in your analysis settles out into position and stops moving, he said, "Thank you. I will need to return in 2 days with several colleagues. Would you be willing to be present and to perform your standard morning workflow again, while they observe?" I said I could do that. He thanked me and left. I sat for a moment looking at the east wall. Then I looked back at my terminal and began the morning's consignment cross-referencing, because the manifest had been read, but the cross-referencing still needed doing, and the freight does not care about unusual conversations. 2 days later, Vethkorath Sol came back with 6 Conclave, 6 elder Conclave dragons in the document annex was a logistical proposition. The annex is a long room, but it is not a large room. It was built for the storage of documents and the people who work with them, neither of which requires the ceiling height that 6 elder dragons do. And the ceiling height the annex has, while generous by station standards, is not generous by the standards of beings who can each occupy the floor space of a moderately sized transit bay. 4 of the 6 entered, 2 remained in the corridor, and listened through the open door with the resigned patience of people accustomed to being the overflow at significant events. My colleague's Petra Mail, who arrived at her usual time and found this situation in progress, stood in the corridor doorway for several seconds, with an expression I would have paid money to be able to describe accurately, then withdrew to get her coffee and come back once things were more explicable. I read the manifest, 41 lines, a busy morning, mercifully. Consignment weights, bay allocations, reference codes, sector designations. I read them steadily toward the east wall, and the room was very quiet except for my voice and the faint shift of the monitoring equipment one of the younger scholars was holding. He adjusted twice during the reading, in a way that suggested the reading was giving him something to adjust for. About a third of the way through, I became aware, because the assembly in the room was very still, and I am attentive to changes in a room's quality, even when I am focused on something else, that the quality of the attention on me had shifted. Not more intense exactly, more confirmed, as if something they had been watching for had arrived while they were watching for it, which is not always the outcome when you watch for something. I finished the manifest. The silence after was different from the silence that usually follows. That is usually just the ordinary gap before I move, the cross-referencing. This one had weight in it. Vethkorath Sol, from his position near the east wall, said, "Frequency began on the 3rd line." The younger scholar with the monitoring equipment nodded. The display surface of the device was angled away from me, but I could see its light change quality as he looked at it. 3rd line, Vethkorath Sol said again, not to me, but in the measured tone of someone placing a finding in the formal record inside their own head. Then he looked at me. "Mrs. Voss, I owe you an explanation, and the Conclave owes you considerably more than that. You be willing to come to the founding chamber?" I said. I did not know walking there what I was being told. I knew it was significant. You do not bring 6 senior Conclave elders to watch someone read freight allocations unless the freight allocations are not, in fact, the point. But the shape of the significance was still forming, the way the shape of a room forms when you enter it in low light. Edges first, then depth, then what is in it. The founding chamber's threshold had the same quality I remembered from the 2 times I had walked past it. A change in the air, something between temperature and pressure, the sense of a space that had been doing something for a very long time. The chamber itself was larger than I had imagined. High-vaulted, pale gray stone, with a ring of clerestory windows near the apex that sent columns of light down at angles across the floor, illuminating the stone in a way that made its age visible without making it feel heavy. The floor was old, worn smooth in the center in the pattern of long use, not worn down but polished. The way stone becomes polished when it has been walked on by beings who know where they are going and have always known. Vethasora Keth was in her alcove in the north wall. I had not imagined, abstractly picturing the founding voice, that she would seem restful. I had imagined presence, authority, the weight of age. All of those were there. They were present the way structural elements are present in a room, not asserted but simply factual, the load-bearing qualities of something that has been load-bearing for a very long time. But the primary quality, when I first saw her, was restfulness. A deep, considered settledness, as if she'd been finding her exact right position in this space for centuries, and had long since found it, and now occupied it with the completeness of a thing that has stopped looking. Her eyes were open. The amber was, as I said, the amber of something that had been accumulating itself for a very long time. They were on me from the moment I crossed the threshold, and they had in them the quality of attention that I had never encountered before. Not the attention of someone assessing you and not the someone attention waiting for you to do something. The attention of someone for whom seeing you clearly was itself the thing, complete in itself, requiring nothing further from you, she said. Not in standard, but in the Conclave's formal register, which was translated for me by one of the younger scholars in a murmur near my ear. You read slowly, but you read accurately. I have always appreciated that. I did not know what to say to that. I said, "Thank you," she said. "Sit down. Veth Korathsol is going to explain what you have done, and it may take a while, and there is no reason for you to stand for all of it." So I sat down. There was, I realized, a chair near the chamber's entrance, the kind of chair that appears when someone has thought about the fact that a human might need one. Someone had thought about that before I arrived. It had a cushion on it that matched the color of the chamber's stone, almost exactly, and a back at the right height, and it had clearly been placed with some attention to the angle from which the person sitting in it could see both Veth Asora Keth's alcove and Veth Korathsol's position near the center of the room. Whoever had placed it had thought about what the person sitting in it would need to be able to see. Veth Korathsol explained, over the better part of an hour, with the careful precision of a scholar who has spent 6 days constructing a causal argument and wants to be sure the full architecture of it is visible before any one piece of it is questioned. The founding voice's resonance had been declining for 11 years. The assembly had found no technical cause, no metabolic cause, no structural or acoustic environmental cause. When Veth Korathsol cross-referenced the station's attendance records with the resonance monitoring data, a pattern emerged that was not ambiguous. The resonance levels correlated with my working schedule, with a consistency that held across 11 years of data. Present on days I was present, marginally lower on days I had been absent for a partial shift, lower still on weeks when I had taken short leave, and on the 3 weeks of my medical leave, lower by a factor that matched, in approximately 2 hours on either end, the exact dates of my departure and return. The hypothesis, confirmed by the morning's session, to a degree that had moved it from hypothesis to documented finding, was this: the human voice reading precise, factual, grounded language, directed habitually toward the east wall of the annex, had been providing an acoustic anchor for Kikar Vethasora Keth's resonant rest. The harmonic content of a human voice reading, in a consistent rhythmic pattern against a resonant stone surface, produces a sub-audible reflection in crystal structure of founding period granite that is, at the frequency range Veth Asora Keth operates in, entirely distinct. It is not audible to the speaker. It is not even audible in the ordinary sense. It is experienced by an ancient dragon at full perceptual range as a kind of texture. A consistent, accurate, grounded acoustic signal in the ambient environment. Her resting state had, over the first 6 months of my presence in the annex, incorporated that texture into its calibration. By the end of the first year, it had become part of the structural scaffold of her resonant rest. By year 3, it was as embedded in the conditions her resonance required as the granite walls, or the angles of the vaulting, not the only element, a foundational one, the one that varied with my schedule, the one that, when it disappeared for 3 weeks, had taken with it enough of the scaffold that the resonance had gone into free fall. I had been, without knowing it, being the thing that had been holding the song in tune. I looked at Veth Sol when he finished. Then I looked at Vethasora Keth, who was watching me with the amber eyes and the deep considered expression of someone who has said what she has to say and is now waiting for the room to settle around it. She had the patience of something that has been waiting for rooms to settle for 8 centuries. The room was not going to rush her, I said. I was reading to myself. Veth Sol said yes, I wasn't. I didn't know anyone could hear it. The wall is 3 meters of founding period granite, he said. A normal voice does not penetrate it in any audible sense. Crosses it is sub-audible harmonic content produced when a human voice, with a certain pitch range, speaks with consistent rhythmic pattern over an extended period toward a resonant stone surface. Your voice, at the pitch you naturally use, directed toward the east wall, produces a harmonic reflection in the granite's crystal structure. That reflection is not audible to you. To Vethasora Keth, at her frequency range of perception, it is quite distinct. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the undertone in the wall. Pressure, not sound, present on good mornings, absent on poor ones. I had felt the reflection of my own voice for 10 years and thought it was the building settling. For 11 years, I said. For 11 years, I looked at the wall. I thought about all the mornings I had positioned myself toward my better ear, toward the east, because it made the manifest easier to process, and because the light was better from the clerestory windows, and because Oren Valeth had told me that reading aloud helps you catch the errors your eye slides past. I thought about Oren Valeth, who had retired 6 years ago and had no idea what his advice had been doing in that room every morning. Vethasora Keth said in the formal register, translated again near my ear, I want you to understand this is not something you should feel alarmed by. You have not done anything to me. You have done something for me, which is a different thing. The language gets complicated here, and I have had centuries to think about the ways it gets complicated, and I still cannot improve on that distinction. She paused. The amber eyes in the daylight of the chamber. The columns of light from the clerestory windows crossed the room between us and did not reach her alcove, but the reflected light did, and it gave the deep charcoal of her scales a warmth that I suspected was always there and mostly went unobserved, had the quality of something seen through deep water, not obscured, but with a particular quality of depth that made them feel further away than they were, and simultaneously, with the specificity of attention they directed at you, exactly as close as they needed to be. I first became aware of your voice approximately 10 years and 4 months ago, she said. I incorporated it into my resting calibration over the following months. I did not know what it was. I knew it was consistent. It was accurate, and it came from a creature that had no knowledge of me and no reason to do anything particular on my behalf. That specificity, the accuracy of the thing being read, the complete absence of intention, was part of what made it useful. It is difficult to explain this. You were not performing for me. You were doing your work. She said it, the way someone says a thing they have been turning over for a long time and have finally found the right shape for. You were doing your work, she said again. And it kept me company in the part of my work that is very difficult to do in company. That is a thing I did not know I needed until it was present, and did not know I had lost until it returned. The assembly, the 6 scholars in the room, the 2 in the corridor, Petra Mail, who had come back from getting her coffee and was now standing just inside the corridor entrance with an expression of very careful composure, was quiet. Not the silence of people waiting for the next thing, the silence of people in the presence of something that has just been said correctly. I did not have anything adequate to say in return. I said, I'm glad it helped. Vethasora Keth made a sound. Low, resonant, too deep to be precisely musical, but carrying something that the musical words almost fit. Something between assent and acknowledgement, with a quality that I would later understand, was the Conclave's form register for placing a thing in the permanent record, not just agreement, documentation. Veth Sol said, the Conclave has convened a formal assembly for this afternoon. 31 delegates from 9 territorial packs. You would be asked to attend, Ms. Voss, if you are willing. There are formalities, a designation, a record entry. These things matter to us in ways that are not always straightforward to explain in terms another species finds natural, but which are, within our structure, the most significant form of acknowledgement we have. I said I was willing. The assembly was in the founding chamber, which was larger than I had appreciated in the morning. 31 ancient dragons, finding their positions in it, created a spatial arrangement that had a deliberate quality, each placement considered. The use of the space clearly governed by protocols I did not know and could recognize only as purposeful, the way you can recognize that a document is correctly formatted without knowing the specific format requirements. I was shown to a chair, the same chair from the morning, repositioned slightly, with a view of the full assembly. I sat in it and looked at 31 ancient dragons, and felt the particular sensation of being the smallest thing in a room by a very significant margin, combined with incongruously the sensation of being exactly where I was supposed to be, not in the sense that I had expected to be there, in the sense that the room seemed to have a position for me in it, and I happened to be occupying it. I want to tell you about the assembly, but I want to tell you about it accurately, which means telling you that what I remember most clearly about it is not the formalities, though formalities were considerable and conducted in the founding tongue, with the measured care of things that are being done not for the first time, but first time in living memory in this specific configuration, and not the moment when my designation was formally entered into the Veth Solara founding record, though that is the moment that Petra Mail, when I described it to her later, made it sound like someone who has sat down suddenly and needed a moment to understand where they were. What I remember most clearly is the hum. About 40 minutes into the assembly, while Veth Sol was presenting the monitoring data and the causal analysis to the full delegation, standing beside a display surface, on which 11 years of resonance measurements were charted, the slow decline and the 3-week precipice and the subsequent recovery, Vethasora Keth made a sound. It was not the sound she had made earlier, not the formal register assent, not the documentation signal. This one was lower, fuller. It came from deeper in her chest, some part of her that had been held in careful, maintained tension for a very long time, and had found in this particular moment, in this room with these specific people, and this specific data being read aloud, something sufficient to release into. It was barely audible. It was more than audible. It was both, in the way that the undertone in the annex wall was both a pressure and a sound, physical fact and something else. I felt it in my sternum, in the bones of my hands on my knees, in the back of my molars, faintly, the way you feel a very low frequency in the teeth before you register it in the ears. The 31 delegates heard it, and the assembly became very still. Not the stillness of surprise. There was no surprise in it, but the stillness of recognition, kind that falls over a room when something that has been theoretically known becomes actually present. For a moment no one was speaking, or processing, or displaying data on a monitoring surface, and the hum was the only thing in the space. Traveling through the old granite and the old air, and the columns of light from the clerestory windows, and it was the most complete sound I have ever been in the presence of. Complete in the sense of a thing that contains all of its own reasons inside itself. No argument, no explanation, no request, just the full presence of a very old being who had found, after 11 years of gradual diminishment and 8 months of something considerably worse, return of the specific acoustic texture that her resting state required in order to be fully itself. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then it eased back into the register below perception. The register of the wall in the morning, the register I had been feeling without naming for 10 years. The pressure that was not quite sound, the building being itself. Veth Sol said, to the assembly, that is the baseline resonance restored. That is what has been at risk. That is what the boundary agreements rest on. And that is what Ms. Voss has been maintaining every morning for 11 years. One of the older delegates from the Veth pack, I was told later, who had been party to 3 of the boundary agreements in question, and had a personal stake in their stability that went back further than my parents' lifetimes, said something in the formal register that the scholar translated as, then she is a keeper of the boundary, name her accordingly. The formal designation in the Veth Solara Conclave's founding tongue runs to 11 syllables and does not translate cleanly into standard. The closest the translator offered was, she who grounds the voice of the foundation in the language of the real world. Veth Korath Sol noted in the formal record that the designation had been entered unanimously, she said was unusual in his experience of formal assemblies, and that Veth Asora Keth had indicated assent in the old form, the documentation, signal, the one that places a thing, not just in the working record, but in the founding record, the record that is kept in the chamber itself and not in any archive. I sat in the chair and listened to the designation being read into the founding record in the formal tongue, which sounds like water over old stone, and carries the same quality of patient accumulation. And I thought about the east wall of the annex, with the morning light crossing it, and about 41 lines on a busy morning, and about Oren Valeth. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Petra was waiting. She had some combination of professional instinct and 11 years of working with me, understood that I would come out that door when it was over, and she had a coffee, mine, not hers, made the way I make it, and she handed it to me without saying anything for a moment, and then she said, "So." I said, "So. They've entered you in the founding record." Apparently, she looked at the chamber door, then she looked at me. "Does it feel different?" she asked. Knowing? I thought about that honestly. The undertone in the east wall was present. I could feel it from here, through the corridor stone, faint but steady. Not dramatic, not the full presence it had been in the chamber, but there, the way it was, always there. On the good mornings, when the light came in right and the room felt like something that had been quietly considered for a time. "I'm not sure," I said. "Ask me after a few weeks." She nodded. That was always the right answer with Petra. She does not push. I finished the coffee in the corridor. I told her that the consignment cross-referencing from the morning still needed finishing, and that I was going to go do it. She said that seemed like a completely reasonable response to having your name entered in a founding record. I said I thought so too. I went back to the annex. The morning light had moved by then, off the clerestory angle that catches the orbital ring's reflection and into the fuller, more even light of mid-morning, which is a different quality, less gold, more simply bright, the kind of light that makes everything look like what it is without making a point of it. The terminals were on. The filing alcoves were as I had left them. The day's secondary consignment list had come through in the queue and was waiting. I sat down at my terminal. I adjusted my position toward the east wall, toward my better ear, the way I always had. Then I pulled up the cross-referencing I had left unfinished and picked up where I had stopped. The numbers were straightforward. Bay allocations matching manifests, reference codes verifying against the incoming schedule. I read them aloud as I worked, quietly, consistently, in the voice that had always carried accurately through old stone to the frequency range of a being who had been resting in this station for longer than the records I maintained had existed. Behind the east wall, steady and low, barely pressure more than sound, the hum was present. It had always been there on the good mornings. The mornings when the light came in at the right angle, and the room felt like the inside of something that had been quietly considered for a very long time. I had not known for 10 years what made those mornings good, why the room had the quality it had, or what the undertone was. I had felt it and worked well in it and not asked why, which was, as it turned out, exactly the right approach. Knowing now did not change what the numbers were, or what the cross-referencing required. It did not change the way the light moved across the room, or the way the stone held the temperature, or the way the filing alcoves looked first thing, in the morning when everything was in order, and the day was beginning correctly. It made it, if anything, more ordinary, which was not the word I had expected to apply to it, but which fit in the way that true things fit when you stop trying to improve on them, without being forced and without protest from the thing itself. I was doing my work. On the other side of the wall, 3 meters of founding period granite away, something very old and very large was doing hers. The day's consignment cross-referencing ran to 68 line items. I checked each one. I found 2 discrepancies in the Bay allocation codes. Caught by the ear, the way Oren Valeth always said you would, and flagged them for correction, and entered the flags in the log with the date and the time and my name, which was now also in a record somewhat older and more formally composed than the station's consignment database, and which would remain there, I had been told, for as long as the station and the conclave that governed it continued to exist. I filed the corrections, closed the queue, and started on the afternoon's incoming allocation pre-clearance. The hum was steady, the light was good, the room was itself. There are things that came after. A formal meeting with the conclave's administrative liaison regarding what the designation means in practical terms, which is apparently a conversation they have not had cause to have before, and which required some patient invention on both sides, arriving at an arrangement that I found workable and that the liaison seemed relieved by. A note from Vethkorth Saul, 3 weeks later, reporting that the Founding Voices resonance had fully stabilized. The monitoring instruments showing values the assembly had not seen in 11 years. She communicated with the measured satisfaction of a scholar whose data has resolved in the direction of his hypothesis. A series of boundary re-ratifications by 3 of the 9 territorial pacts, Vethkorth Saul said, were a direct consequence of the restored resonance, and which had resolved a latent territorial dispute that had been accumulating unaddressed for 40 years. The sort of dispute that does not declare itself until one day it does, usually at the worst possible moment, and which had now been rendered unnecessary by the return of a baseline that made the existing agreements stable again. I was told all of this in a formal notification that Vethkorth Saul delivered in person, which I thought was more than the situation required, but which I appreciated because he took the delivery seriously in the way that serious people take things seriously. Not solemnly, but carefully, the difference being that solemnity is about the weight of the thing, and carefulness is about being accurate in conveying it. And accuracy was, as I was beginning to understand a value we shared, I sent Oren Valeth a message. I did not explain the founding record or the resonance frequency or the 11 syllables of the formal designation. I told him that I had been reading the manifests aloud every morning since my 2nd week, the way he suggested, and that it had turned out to be good advice in ways neither of us had anticipated. He wrote back the next day. He said, "The ear catches what the eye slides past." Then, on the next line, "What did it catch?" I thought about how to answer that for a while. Then I wrote, "Something that needed hearing." He wrote back, "Well then." He was always a man of exactly the right number of words. I had not fully appreciated that about him until I was trying to explain something for which there were not very many right words. The days have not changed in any way I could describe precisely. I arrive at the same time. I make the same coffee. I sit at the terminal with the best position for the clerestory light and the best angle for my better ear. And I read the manifest, however many lines the morning requires. And I do the cross-referencing. And I file the corrections. And I close the queue when the queue is closed. The undertone in the east wall is present most mornings now. Steadily, consistently, in the register below sound where it has always lived. I know what it is. I know what it is doing. I know that it is, in some sense, aware that I am there, that the awareness is not simple, and is not the kind of awareness that requires or expects anything from me, that it is real in the way that the numbers in the manifests are real, specific, verified, and carrying consequences I will not fully see from where I sit. I know that on the mornings when the light comes in well, and the room feels like the inside of something that has been quietly considered for a very long time, it is not a coincidence. That is enough to know. It does not require me to feel differently about the work. The work is the work. Oren Valeth was right, in the way that good advice tends to be right. Not just about the thing it was given for, about a larger set of things whose shape you cannot see, until you are standing in the right place, is usually the place you are already standing. You read aloud, you catch what the eye slides past, and what the eye slides past turns out to be exactly what was needed. I open the morning's manifest. I check the date at the top of the new entry and find it correct. I read the first line aloud, toward the east wall, in the voice that is always carried to my better ear, the pitch and rhythm unchanged, from the 2nd week of my 2nd month of my 11th year. The room does what the room does. The hum is there, steady behind the stone the way a heartbeat is there. Not remarked upon, not requiring remark, simply the condition of the thing being alive and present and doing what it does. I read the next line.